A single moment in a deserted classroom unveiled a side of my teacher I never anticipated. What transpired next irrevocably altered my perception of everything. Mr. Harris, our history instructor, had always embodied authority in the classroom, stern yet just, serious yet approachable. I never questioned his presence. He was simply the educator who navigated us through ancient civilizations and historical debates. But that afternoon, something shifted. I was gathering my books when he called out, "Frank, could you hold on a moment? I need to discuss your essay." Initially, it didn't seem unusual. I often stayed after class to consult with teachers. I slung my bag over my shoulder and turned. "Sure, Mr. Harris, what's up?" He glanced up from the papers on his desk, his eyes briefly meeting mine before returning to the stack he was reviewing. "I wanted to tell you how impressed I am with your recent work. You've been putting in a lot of effort, and it's evident." Pride surged through me. I always strive to excel, but hearing his commendation felt different, significant. I smiled, a little shy under his gaze. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been trying." He didn't respond immediately, instead rising from his desk and approaching me. The space between us, usually professional, now felt closer, too close. "I know you've been dealing with a lot lately," he continued, his voice hushed, confidential. "School is challenging, and I know you're under a lot of pressure." I nodded. It was true. Senior year was a whirlwind of assignments, exams, and the daunting task of planning my future. My mind was constantly racing, and the pressure was relentless. But I hadn't expected him to notice. Mr. Harris wasn't just my teacher, he was distant, professional. He'd always been a mentor, an authority figure, but now he seemed different, almost human in a way I wasn't accustomed to. "You know, Frank," he said, stepping closer, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here. You're a bright student, and it's clear you're capable of so much more." There was an intensity in his tone that made me pause. My heart quickened. Something was changing between us, something I couldn't define. "Thank you, Mr. Harris." "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, unable to shake the feeling that his gaze lingered too long, his words too weighted. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual teacher smile. It was softer, more knowing, like he understood more than just my academics. "I mean it, Frank. I'm not just talking out about your grades. You've got potential. It's in the way you think, the way you carry yourself." I shifted uneasily, flattered yet uncomfortable. His words were genuine, but laced with something else, something I couldn't quite place. I cleared my throat. I should probably get going. My mom's expecting me. He nodded, but didn't move. There was a pause, an awkward silence. The tension in the room thickened. "You know," he said, breaking the stillness, "I'm leaving soon, too. Would you like a ride? I'm driving in your direction." A ride? The offer surprised me. We'd never crossed that line. I knew Mr. Harris was a good teacher, but offering a ride felt too personal, too unusual. I hesitated. I usually walk home. He shrugged casually, his eyes fixed on me. "It's no trouble. It's just on my way. Don't worry about it." Something in his voice was persuasive, and against my better judgment, I agreed. "Okay, I guess. Thanks." We walked out of the classroom together. The hallways were quiet, the usual student bustle gone. The air felt still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was different. There was an unspoken shift, something simmering beneath the surface. He led me to his car, and we both got in. As the doors closed, a silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, but not natural either. His presence, His proximity felt almost intimate in a way I hadn't anticipated. The drive began quietly. The usual car chatter was replaced by the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. I stared at the road, a nervous flutter in my stomach. "So, Frank," Mr. Harris said, breaking the silence, "how have things been outside of school? You've been under a lot of stress lately, haven't you?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, it's been tough trying to keep up with everything, you know." He glanced at me, his gaze soft but intense. "I can imagine. You're a bright student, Frank. It's hard to juggle everything." I wasn't sure what to say. His attention, the way he was looking at me, made my heart race. I hadn't expected this. I had always seen him as the teacher, the authority figure, but now, in this quiet car, he seemed so much closer, real, even vulnerable. When we reached my street, I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't sure what I'd been expecting, but the air between us felt charged, like something was about to happen. But then, just as quickly as it began, it seemed to dissipate. "Here we are," he said, slowing the car to a stop outside my house. "I hope you got something useful out of today's lesson." "Yeah, definitely," I replied, my voice a little too high-pitched. I opened the door and stepped out, but before closing it completely, I turned back. "Thanks for the ride, Mr. Harris." He smiled, that same soft, knowing smile. "Any time, Frank." As I walked toward my front door, I glanced back. Mr. Harris hadn't moved. He was sitting in his car, watching me, his eyes still fixed on me. That strange tension lingered, refusing to dissolve. Just like that, I knew things had changed. Something had shifted between us. Something was beginning, and I had no clue where it would lead. But one thing was certain. It wasn't going to be just another normal school day anymore. And that was just the beginning. The following days felt different. I kept replaying the ride home in my mind, Mr. Harris's words, his gestures, the way he seemed to look at me like I wasn't just another student. It kept me awake at night. It wasn't like me to overthink these things. Normally, I could dismiss such moments, but something about him, the way he made me feel seen, was unsettling. I wasn't sure if I liked it or if I was imagining things. I tried to ignore it initially. After all, it was a one-time occurrence, right? Mr. Harris was just being kind, offering a ride because it was on his way. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. But it didn't feel that way. The next day, walking to class, my heart pounded faster than usual. I hoped I could slip in unnoticed, get through the day, and go home without any awkwardness. I didn't want to face him. But there he was, waiting by the classroom door, looking directly at me as I approached, as if he'd been expecting me. "Frank," he called out, and I froze. I avoided his eyes, but his gaze was magnetic. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," I said, my voice too high-pitched. He smiled, and it made my stomach churn. "You seem like you're in a hurry today. Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just busy." "Busy," he repeated with a knowing look. "You're always so composed, Frank. I guess we all have our days." I wanted to tell him it wasn't just a busy day. It was the kind of day where I couldn't escape the strange tension between us. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded again and hurried into class. Even in class, I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting towards him. Mr. Harris was at the front of the room, his back to us as he wrote on the board, but I could still feel his presence, his gaze lingering on me. It was distracting. Every time he asked a question or made a joke, I was hyper-aware of his voice, the way he smiled at me. Every small interaction felt charged, as if something lurked beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at me differently, like he saw something I wasn't ready to confront. As the bell rang, Mr. Harris dismissed everyone but called me over. "Frank," he said, his voice softer now, "can you stay back for a second?" I stopped, heart pounding. "Sure, Mr. Harris," I said, trying to sound casual. The room emptied, leaving us alone in the quiet space. He sat at his desk, gesturing for me to approach. My legs felt heavy as I walked toward him. "You did well in class today," he said, making small talk, but his eyes were intense, watching me closely. "But I noticed you seemed a little distracted. Everything okay?" I paused. I didn't want to lie, but I couldn't tell him the truth. I didn't know what the truth was. Was I distracted by his presence? Was it wrong to feel the way I did? "I'm fine," I said unconvincingly. He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "You know, Frank, I've been thinking. I see a lot of potential in you, not just academically, but—" He paused, his eyes flickering. "But in everything you do." The way he said it, the pause before "and everything you do" made my pulse race. It was like he was trying to say more, but wasn't sure if he should. I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice small. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. A faint smile played on his lips, but it wasn't his usual teacher smile. This one seemed almost personal. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Frank," he said quietly, his tone low and deliberate. "You've been working hard, and you've always been focused, but lately you seem distant. Something's changed, hasn't it?" I felt a sudden heat in my chest. It was as though he'd seen right through me, through the walls I'd built. I couldn't speak. I felt exposed, vulnerable under his gaze. Before I could say anything, the door opened. I looked over my shoulder, relieved to see a classmate returning for a forgotten item. "Sorry, Mr. Harris, I left my notebook," the student said, retrieving it from the desk. "Go ahead," Mr. Harris replied curtly, dismissing them. His eyes met mine for a moment before the student left the room. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice strangely hushed as the student vanished. I nodded rapidly, practically fleeing the room as the bell rang. My legs trembled, my heart hammered against my ribs. What was this? Throughout the day, the encounter replayed in my mind. His gaze, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I wasn't accustomed to this attention. I had to speak with him again, regain my composure. The following afternoon, I lingered after class, hoping for a conversation in a calmer setting. The room was deserted, save for myself, waiting for him to finish his work. I approached his desk unnoticed. When he looked up, his eyes held that familiar glint, as if he'd anticipated my arrival. "Back for more, Frank?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips that stole my breath. I swallowed. I just wanted to finish that assignment, I mumbled, avoiding eye contact. As I spoke, he moved closer, a mere few inches separating us. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the proximity accelerating my pulse. "I know you're a dedicated student," he said softly, leaning in, his voice almost intimate. "But I also know there's more to you than just your grades." I tried to back away, but the desk trapped me. I was caught, torn between flight and staying put. His gaze held mine, its weight palpable. "Frank, you're not just a student to me," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "You're someone I care about. I've been watching you for a long time." I wanted to retort, to push him away, but words failed me. This situation was unfamiliar, leaving me feeling utterly uncertain. His nearness was overwhelming. I felt on the precipice of something I wasn't prepared for. Then his fingers brushed mine, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through me. The tension I'd suppressed for days shattered. The space between us evaporated. I started, but the words died in my throat. The subsequent days were a haze. I couldn't concentrate in class. Every time Mr. Harris spoke, my heart skipped a beat. I knew this was wrong. He was my teacher, my mentor. But that moment in the classroom, the brush of his fingers had changed everything. I couldn't deny the spark between us, the way our proximity ignited something deeper. It didn't help that every time I passed him, he offered that knowing half-smile as if privy to the thoughts racing through my mind. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. One afternoon, I lingered after class again. The others had departed, leaving an unusual intimacy in the quiet classroom. I feigned working on an assignment, but my thoughts were elsewhere, focused on him. What would he say this time? How far would he push? I heard his footsteps behind me, and my chest fluttered in anticipation. "Frank," his voice was low, almost a murmur. "I thought you'd be heading out by now." I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no turning back. He looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. His eyes were darker today, more intense. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I was just finishing up," I stammered, my nervousness evident. "You don't need to pretend with me," he said, approaching my desk, his presence filling the room until only a whisper of space remained. I swallowed, my pulse racing. "I'm not pretending." He paused, his eyes locked on mine. There was something there, something indefinable. It wasn't just a teacher's concern. It was more. His hand grazed the back of my chair, sending shivers down my spine. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "I don't want you to feel like you have to keep your distance," he murmured. "You don't have to hide from me." His words were gentle, yet undeniably potent. They made my heart pound, my stomach clench. I didn't know whether to move closer or flee. My body decided for me. I stood, slowly, instinctively. I looked at him, feeling the undeniable pull. It wasn't just physical proximity. It was the way he made me feel like the only person in the room. "Frank," he said again, his voice rough, as if he were struggling to maintain control. "There's something about you." I felt my breath hitch. Something about that phrase, the way he uttered it, weakened my knees. It wasn't just the fact that he was a teacher. It was the way he looked at me, like he truly saw me. Not just the student, but me. Everything I was all at once. I stepped closer, driven by an impulse I couldn't resist. He didn't retreat. Instead, he closed the remaining distance, his eyes locked on mine. His breath warmed my skin, and I felt the heat radiating from him. His hand lifted, brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The simple gesture sent my heart racing. "You don't know what you do to me," he whispered. I was speechless. Every instinct screamed at me to pull back, but my mind clung to his touch, his words. It was overwhelming, yet exactly what I craved. Before I could process anything further, he did the unexpected. He leaned in, inches from my face. I felt the warmth of his breath, the intensity of his gaze. Then, without warning, his lips were on mine. The kiss wasn't passionate at first, but slow, hesitant, as if he expected me to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. The moment his lips met mine, the world dissolved. It was just him, just us, suspended in time. His hand moved to the back of my neck, drawing me closer. The kiss deepened, and my body responded with a fervor I couldn't explain. My head spun, every nerve ending alight with sensation. I knew this was wrong, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. When he finally broke away, I was breathless, my lips tingling. A wave of guilt and desire washed over me. "Frank," he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. I shouldn't have done that, but I couldn't help myself. I nodded, still dazed, unable to speak. Part of me wanted to retreat, to tell him this was a mistake. But another part of me, the part already captivated by him, yearned for more. He seemed to sense my inner turmoil. "I'm not going to push you, Frank," he said softly, his thumb brushing my cheek. "But I can't ignore what's between us. You feel it too, don't you?" I closed my eyes, trying to control my breathing. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to deny it, to pretend I didn't feel the same, but I couldn't lie to myself. I felt it. I don't know what this is," I whispered, "but I can't stop thinking about it." He didn't respond immediately, but I saw the conflict in his eyes. He stepped back slightly, giving me space, though his gaze remained unwavering. "Maybe we shouldn't do this," he said after a long pause. "Maybe we should just walk away before we make things more complicated." I stared at him, uncertain. My heart pounded, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I didn't know if I should run or stay and explore this unknown territory. "I don't know if I can walk away," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't think I want to." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. We stood there, staring at each other, the world outside fading away, leaving just the two of us in the charged silence. I didn't know what would happen next, how we could continue without crossing lines we couldn't uncross. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It might never be. The days following the kiss were agonizing. Each morning, I woke with the taste of him on my lips, the memory of his touch burning on my skin. It wasn't just the kiss itself, but everything that followed. The silence, the unspoken words, the uncertainty of whether we were heading toward something dangerous or a fleeting mistake. Every time I entered the classroom, I tried to act normal, but normalcy felt like a distant memory. Mr. Harris seemed perpetually restrained, as if holding himself back from saying or doing something that would change everything. I hated how he made me feel, yet I craved more. The attraction was undeniable. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The subtle drop in his voice when he spoke to me. He wasn't just my teacher anymore. He was something else entirely. It was the quiet moments that were the most potent. When we were alone, the rest of the class long gone, the silence amplified the tension between us. Every glance, every word felt weighted. My heart raced whenever he came close, my skin prickling with the awareness that we were playing a dangerous game. But I couldn't stop myself. I wanted him. I wanted to explore the connection between us, even if it meant risking everything. One afternoon, it happened again. I stayed after class, as I had every day since the kiss, to finish some work. I could tell he was trying to maintain a professional distance, but I sensed the shift. It was in the lingering glances, the way he adjusted his tie as if steadying himself. There was no going back. "Frank," he said softly as I gathered my papers, the sound of my name on his lips sending a shiver down my spine. "Stay for a minute." I turned, meeting his eyes. He stood by his desk, hand resting on the surface as if gathering the courage to speak. My heart pounded. I knew what this was about. The past few days had been filled with loaded glances and pregnant silences, but we couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. "Of course," I replied, walking towards him. My voice sounded steady, but inwardly I was a maelstrom of emotions. He remained silent at first, observing me as if trying to decipher how to proceed. Then, in a swift movement, he reached for my hand, gently drawing me closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Frank," he murmured, his voice low and strained. "I can't keep pretending like nothing happened between us." My breath hitched, but I didn't pull away. I should have. I should have told him this was wrong, that I needed to leave. But the way he held my hand, the slight tightening of his fingers, made it all feel undeniably real. "I don't want to pretend," I whispered, barely audible. I don't think I can anymore." He stepped closer, his other hand rising to cup my cheek. The warmth of his palm sent a wave of heat through me. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the intensity of the moment. "I never meant to put you in this position," he said quietly, his thumb stroking my skin, "but I can't ignore this, not anymore." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What are we doing, Mr. Harris?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What is this?" "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I can't walk away from it." I wasn't sure I was ready for what he was about to say, but I needed to hear it. I needed to understand what this was, what it meant for us. He didn't speak, but instead leaned down, capturing my lips in a kiss that felt different this time. It wasn't hesitant or slow. It was desperate, urgent, as if he couldn't contain himself any longer. I kissed him back without reservation, my hands moving to his chest, pulling him closer as if to erase the distance between us. The kiss deepened, and everything else faded away. There was no classroom, no rules, only him and me and the overwhelming pull between us. He broke the kiss first, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His forehead rested against mine as we both struggled to regain composure. "I want you, Frank," he confessed, his voice hoarse. "I can't stop thinking about you." His words sent a rush of heat through me. I had wanted him too, but hearing him admit it felt like a revelation I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to speak, but all I could do was stare at him, uncertain where this was leading us. "I can't do this," I whispered, pulling back slightly. My mind was a blur, torn between desire and what I knew was right. His expression softened, but a deeper emotion lingered in his eyes. "You don't have to decide now," he said, "but I can't promise I'll be able to hold back much longer, Frank." The tension between us was thick, suffocating. I didn't know how to respond. Everything inside me screamed to pull away, but my body betrayed me, drawn to him with an undeniable force. Every moment with him felt like a burning need I couldn't ignore. But I knew what we were doing was wrong, dangerous. If we didn't stop now, I didn't know how we'd ever escape. "I need to go," I said, my voice breaking as I stepped back, my body trembling. "I can't do this." He didn't stop me as I gathered my things and hurried to the door. I heard him softly call my name, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I made it out of the classroom, but my legs felt weak, my head spinning. I didn't know what we had started, but I knew there was no turning back. I couldn't undo what had happened. As I walked down the empty hallway, the weight of that realization settled upon me. I had crossed a line. I walked out of the classroom in a daze, my steps unsteady, my mind racing. The moment with Mr. Harris replayed on a loop. The kiss, his touch, the way he looked at me as if seeing right through me. It felt like a dream, a beautiful, dangerous dream I couldn't shake. But I had to. I had to push it away, move forward, and pretend nothing had changed. But how? How could I return to the way things were when everything felt so irrevocably different? I made my way home, but even in the quiet of my room, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. I wanted to forget, but the truth was, I didn't. Part of me had yearned for this connection, for his attention, even if it was wrong. But the other part of me, the part that recognized the boundaries we had crossed, felt the insidious creep of guilt, reminded me of everything I stood to lose. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been done.